Imagine being hungry every single day of your life. Not the kind of hunger that appears when lunch is late, not the kind that disappears after a quick snack, but a deeper hunger, a constant hunger. A hunger that follows you from the moment you open your eyes until the moment exhaustion finally drags you to sleep. Now imagine experiencing that hunger while surrounded by food, mountains of food, tables overflowing with roasted meats, fresh bread still warm from the oven, rich puddings, cream cakes, golden pastries, feasts large enough to feed entire villages. And yet none of it belongs to you. You can smell it, you can touch it, you can carry it, you can serve it, but you cannot eat it. This was the reality for countless Victorian servants. When people think about Victorian England, they often imagine a world of luxury and elegance, grand estates stretching across the countryside, magnificent townhouses glowing beneath gaslight, ladies dressed in silk, gentlemen dining beneath crystal chandeliers. It was an age that celebrated wealth, an age obsessed with status, an age that built some of the most beautiful homes Britain had ever seen. But beneath those homes existed another world, a hidden world, a forgotten world, a world that visitors rarely saw. Below the polished staircases, below the elegant dining rooms, below the glittering ballrooms, there were dark corridors, narrow staircases, tiny bedrooms, hot kitchens, cold basements. And within those spaces lived the servants who made Victorian luxury possible. Without servants, the great houses of Britain could not function. Every fire had to be lit. Every room had to be cleaned. Every meal had to be prepared. Every floor had to be scrubbed. Every piece of silver had to be polished. Every bed had to be made. Every bell had to be answered. The wealthy enjoyed comfort because somebody else worked endlessly to create it, and that somebody was usually a servant. For many young people, entering service began with hope. A girl from a poor farming family might hear stories about wealthy households. She might imagine regular meals, a stable income, a chance to escape poverty, perhaps even a better future. But reality often arrived quickly. The moment she entered service, her life changed. She no longer belonged to herself. Her schedule belonged to her employer. Her movements belonged to her employer. Even her meals depended entirely on the goodwill of her employer. A servant's day often began before sunrise. The house remained silent. The family slept peacefully upstairs, but below stairs, work had already begun. Kitchen fires needed lighting. Coal had to be carried. Water had to be heated. Breakfast preparations had to start. The first hours of the morning were often spent working in darkness. Many servants woke at 5 in the morning, some even earlier, and they would continue working until late at night. 14 hours, 15 hours, sometimes 16 hours, day after day, week after week, year after year. There were no weekends in the modern sense. There was very little free time. Rest was a luxury. Exhaustion became normal, and through all of it, food remained one of the biggest concerns in a servant's life. Because, while wealthy Victorians are remembered for extravagant meals, servants often survived on whatever remained. A grand Victorian dinner could involve multiple courses: soup, fish, roasted meats, vegetables, desserts, cheese, fruit. Wine course after course would arrive before guests, seated around elegant tables. The meal could last for hours. The cost of a single dinner sometimes exceeded what a servant earned in several weeks. Meanwhile, the servants preparing and serving that meal often wondered what they themselves would eat later. The contrast was extraordinary. One world overflowed with abundance. The other survived on leftovers. Many servants did not eat until the family had finished dining. Only then could they see what remained. Cold potatoes, bread crusts, Pieces of meat carved from bones. Vegetables nobody wanted. Sometimes these leftovers provided a decent meal. Sometimes they did not. Everything depended on the household. Everything depended on the mood of the employer. Everything depended on chance. Some servants learned to lower their expectations. If there was enough bread, it was a good day. If there was meat, it was an excellent day. If there was dessert left over, it felt almost miraculous. But miracles were rare. Bread became the foundation of survival. Morning after morning, evening after evening, bread appeared on servant tables. Not fresh bread, not the warm loaves enjoyed upstairs. Usually stale bread, bread that had hardened, bread that was several days old, bread that wealthy families no longer wanted. Yet servants ate it gratefully, because stale bread was still food, and food meant survival. Many servants drank weak tea with their meals. The tea leaves used by the family upstairs were sometimes reused downstairs. Hot water would be poured over leaves again and again until almost no flavor remained. The result barely resembled tea, yet it provided warmth. And warmth mattered, especially during winter. Victorian houses could be surprisingly cold. The wealthy occupied the warmest parts of the house. Servants often occupied the coldest. Attic rooms became freezing during winter nights. Basement rooms felt damp and uncomfortable. A servant who spent the day working and the night shivering needed calories, but calories were not always available. And so hunger became familiar. Not starvation, not necessarily, but something quieter, something constant, a dull ache in the stomach, a feeling of never quite having enough. A feeling that followed servants through every hour of the day. Many learned to ignore it, many had no choice, because complaints could be dangerous. Victorian households operated according to strict hierarchies. Servants were expected to obey, to work hard, to remain silent. A servant who complained too often risked dismissal, and dismissal was terrifying. Losing a position did not simply mean losing income. It often meant losing food, losing shelter, losing security. A bad reference from an employer could make finding another job extremely difficult. For many servants, unemployment represented a direct path toward poverty, so they endured. They endured long hours, they endured difficult conditions, and they endured hunger because the alternative seemed worse. Perhaps the strangest part of Victorian service was how close servants lived to wealth. Every day they walked through magnificent rooms. They polished expensive furniture. They handled valuable silver. They served luxurious meals. They witnessed enormous displays of privilege, yet they remained excluded from it all. Imagine carrying a tray filled with roasted beef. The aroma fills the air, your stomach growls. You have been working since before sunrise. You are exhausted, hungry, and the food in your hands looks incredible. But it is not yours. You carry it into the dining room. Plea it before the family. Step back. And watch that moment repeated itself thousands of times across Britain every single day. Servants prepared luxury. Servants delivered luxury. Servants maintained luxury. Yet they rarely shared in it. And nowhere was that inequality more visible than at mealtime. For the wealthy, food represented pleasure. For servants, food represented survival. The difference between those two experiences reveals more about Victorian society than almost anything else. Because while one group debated which dishes they preferred, another group simply hoped there would be enough left to eat. And for many servants, that hope shaped every single day of their lives. As the weeks turned into months, many servants began to realize something disturbing. The hunger never truly disappeared. At first, they believed they would adjust. They told themselves the work would become easier. The long hours would feel shorter, the exhaustion would fade, the meals would somehow become enough. But, for countless servants, that day never arrived. Instead, hunger became part of life, a permanent companion, always present, always waiting. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the kitchens where food was prepared. The Victorian kitchen was the beating heart of the house. Before sunrise, it was already alive. Fires crackled, pots boiled, knives chopped endlessly. Servants hurried between tables carrying ingredients, cleaning dishes and preparing meals that would never belong to them. The kitchen was hot, uncomfortably hot, especially during summer. Massive stoves burned throughout the day. Ovens radiated heat into the room. Steam filled the air. Workers sweated through their clothes while preparing elaborate meals for people upstairs. It was exhausting work. Yet despite spending every day surrounded by food, many servants remained underfed. The irony was impossible to ignore. A servant could spend hours preparing a magnificent roast, seasoning it perfectly, monitoring its temperature, ensuring every detail was flawless. Then she would watch it disappear upstairs. Hours later, she might receive nothing more than a few scraps carved from the remains. The finest portions were reserved for the family. The best vegetables followed. The freshest bread followed. What traveled downstairs was whatever remained, and sometimes what remained was not particularly appetizing. Food preservation during the Victorian era was a constant challenge. Modern refrigerators did not exist. Keeping food fresh required skill, luck, and favorable weather. When temperatures rose, problems appeared quickly. Milk soured, butter spoiled, meat began to turn, vegetables decayed. Households fought a constant battle against time. For wealthy families, spoiled food represented an inconvenience. For servants, it could become dinner. A cook might cut away the visibly rotten portion of meat and save the rest. Bread covered in mold could have the affected sections removed. Vegetables past their best might still be served downstairs. Nothing useful was wasted, not because employers were cruel in every case, but because waste cost money, and servants often occupied the lowest position when resources were distributed. The result was predictable. Many servants regularly consumed food that would never appear on the family dining table. Food that was old, food that was damaged, food that was questionable, food that sometimes made them sick. Illness was a constant threat. A modern stomach is accustomed to safety regulations. Refrigeration and quality control. Victorian servants enjoyed none of those protections. Food poisoning was poorly understood. Bacteria remained invisible. Many people did not fully understand why certain foods caused illness. They only knew that sickness appeared. And when it did, servants often suffered the consequences. Imagine waking before dawn with a fever. Your stomach twists with pain. Your body begs for rest. But rest is not available. The house still needs cleaning. The fires still need lighting. The meals still need preparing. A servant unable to work could quickly become a servant without employment. So many continued working while sick. They worked through headaches. They worked through infections. They worked through exhaustion because survival demanded it. One of the most dangerous necessities of Victorian life was water. Today, clean water feels ordinary. A simple turn of a tap provides something many Victorians could only dream about. But during the 19th century, water quality varied dramatically. In growing cities, contamination was common. Human waste often found its way into water supplies. Industrial pollution made matters worse. Ravas became dumping grounds. Disease spread rapidly. Cholera terrified entire communities. Typhoid fever claimed thousands of lives. Dysentery weakened countless workers, and servants were not immune. In many households, the best drinking water was prioritized for the family. Servants sometimes received lower quality supplies. If the water smelled unpleasant, there was often little choice but to drink it anyway. Physical labor created thirst, and thirst could not be ignored. A maid carrying buckets, scrubbing floors, and climbing staircases all day required constant hydration. The risk was understood, the necessity was greater. So they drank, and hoped for the best. Some households relied heavily on weak beer instead of water, not because servants wished to drink alcohol throughout the day, but because brewing processes sometimes made the liquid safer than untreated water. Even children occasionally consumed small amounts. The alcohol content was usually low. The goal was practicality. The goal was survival. Everything returned to survival. Every decision, every meal, every sacrifice. Survival shaped daily life, and survival often demanded acceptance of poor food, acceptance of harsh conditions, acceptance of a future that looked remarkably similar to the present. Yet despite these hardships, servants found ways to endure. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. Even under difficult circumstances, friendships formed in kitchens. Workers shared stories during rare moments of rest. Small jokes helped lighten long days. Tiny acts of kindness became enormously meaningful. A cook might save an extra piece of bread for a young maid. A housekeeper might quietly overlook a servant taking an additional potato. Such gestures were small, but to someone who was hungry, they felt enormous. Sometimes they meant everything. Many servants came from poor families and understood hardship long before entering service. They had already experienced uncertainty, already experienced sacrifice, already experienced hunger. Service was difficult, but for some, it still represented an improvement over life at home. That fact reveals just how severe poverty could be in Victorian Britain. The servant eating stale bread in a cold basement was sometimes better off than families struggling outside the mansion walls. It was a harsh reality, one that modern readers often find difficult to imagine. Yet millions lived it. Millions navigated a world where security was fragile, and food could never be taken for granted. As years passed, servants developed routines. They learned which employers were generous, which employers were strict, which kitchens offered decent meals, which kitchens offered disappointment. Knowledge became valuable. Experience became valuable, because every servant understood a simple truth. A good household could make life bearable. A bad household could make life miserable. And unfortunately, not everyone found a good household. Many spent years trapped in exhausting routines. Years measured not by celebrations or achievements, but by shifts, meals, and survival. Each day looked remarkably similar to the last. Wake before sunrise. Work, eat, work, sleep, repeat. The cycle seemed endless, yet through it all they continued. Because they had to, because families depended on their wages, because opportunities were limited, because quitting was rarely an option, and because endurance had become a skill. A skill learned through necessity, a skill perfected through hardship, a skill that would carry countless servants through some of the most difficult years of their lives. But the greatest test of endurance was still to come, because when winter arrived, even the little comfort servants possessed could disappear. And for many, the cold season transformed ordinary hardship into a daily struggle for survival. Winter arrived quietly. At first it was only a chill in the morning air, a thin layer of frost on windows, a colder wind slipping beneath doors. But before long, the cold settled everywhere. It crept through stone walls, It settled inside servant bedrooms. It followed workers into kitchens, hallways, and staircases. For wealthy families, winter was often an inconvenience. For servants, it could become a battle. The grand fireplaces that warmed Victorian mansions did not light themselves. Every morning servants carried heavy buckets of coal through dark corridors. They cleaned ashes. They restarted fires. They hauled fuel from storage rooms. And they did it all before most of the household had even opened their eyes. The work was exhausting. The cold made it worse. Many servants lived in attic rooms directly beneath the roof. During winter, these rooms became painfully cold. Thin blankets offered little protection. Ice sometimes formed on the inside of windows. A servant could spend the entire night shivering and still be expected to work a full day the next morning. Sleep offered little recovery. Food offered little comfort. And the body paid the price. The human body requires more energy during cold weather. It burns additional calories trying to stay warm. But many servants were already living on limited diets. Now they faced even greater demands. The result was predictable. Weakness increased, fatigue deepened, illness spread. A simple cold could become dangerous. A chest infection could become life-threatening. And unlike wealthy employers, servants rarely had the luxury of resting until they recovered. The work continued, always, every day. No matter how tired they felt, no matter how sick they became, no matter how desperately their bodies needed a break, Victorian society depended upon this invisible labor, yet it rarely acknowledged the human cost. Visitors admired spotless floors. They admired elegant meals. They admired beautifully maintained homes. Few stopped to think about the people responsible for creating that perfection. Perfection came at a price, and servants paid it. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Victorian servants was not how much they suffered. It was how much they endured. Despite everything, they continued moving forward. They found ways to survive. They found ways to laugh. They found ways to maintain hope, even in circumstances that offered very little reason for optimism. A young maid might spend months saving tiny portions of her wages. A cook might dream of opening a small business one day. A housemaid might hope for marriage and a different future. Dreams mattered because dreams provided escape. If only for a moment, they reminded servants that life might not always remain the same, that hardship might not last forever. For some, those dreams became reality. For many others, they did not. Yet the hope itself remained important, because hope gave people the strength to endure another day, and another, and another. As the 19th century slowly drew to a close, the world began to change. Technology advanced. Education expanded. New forms of employment appeared. Opportunities that had once been unavailable gradually emerged. Domestic service no longer represented the only path for countless young people. The servant population slowly declined. The great houses that had once employed dozens of workers struggled to maintain the same lifestyle. Labor became more expensive. Workers gained more choices. Society evolved. And little by little, the age of the Victorian servant began to fade into history. Yet history often remembers the wrong people. It remembers the owners of the mansions, the politicians, the industrialists, the aristocrats, the individuals whose portraits hung in grand halls. But portraits rarely tell the full story. Behind every wealthy family stood workers whose names have largely been forgotten. The maid who woke before dawn, the cook who spent decades beside a blazing stove, the servant who carried coal until her back ached, the young girl who left home searching for opportunity and found a life of endless labor. These people rarely appeared in history books, yet they were just as real, just as important. and in many ways, far more representative of Victorian life than the wealthy few whose stories dominate the record. Because while luxury existed, so did struggle. While some enjoyed abundance, many endured scarcity. While magnificent feasts took place upstairs, hunger often lingered below stairs. The contrast defined the era. It revealed a society divided by class, opportunity, and privilege. A society where two completely different worlds could exist beneath the same roof. One world dined beneath crystal chandeliers. The other survived on leftovers. One world worried about etiquette. The other worried about survival. One world enjoyed comfort. The other created it. And perhaps that is why the story of Victorian servants remains so powerful today. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, queens, and wealthy families. History is also shaped by ordinary people. People whose names are forgotten. People whose sacrifices went unnoticed. People who worked hard, endured hardship, and carried entire societies upon their shoulders. The servants of Victorian Britain were among those people. They cleaned the houses, prepared the meals, raised the children, maintained the estates, and kept daily life functioning for millions of others. Yet many spent their own lives struggling for basic necessities: food, warmth, rest, doc tutory. Things most people today take for granted. Their story is not a story of glamour. It is not a story of luxury. It is a story of resilience, of survival, of ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship and refusing to give up. The next time you see a photograph of a Victorian mansion, look beyond the beauty. Look beyond the chandeliers. Look beyond the silver dining sets and elegant furniture. Imagine the hidden corridors. Imagine the basement kitchens. Imagine the attic bedrooms. Imagine the workers moving silently through the shadows. And remember that every magnificent feast came with another story. A story of leftovers. A story of long hours. A story of hunger. A story of determination. Because, while the wealthy enjoyed the spotlight, it was the servants who carried the weight of everyday life. They endured cold winters. They endured exhausting labor. They endured poor food and uncertain futures. And despite everything, they survived. That survival is their legacy. Not the scraps they ate, not the hardships they endured, but the extraordinary strength that allowed them to continue, day after day, year after year, in a world that often overlooked them. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden beneath the grand staircases of Victorian Britain. The people history forgets are often the people who kept history moving forward. But before we leave this world behind, there is one final truth we need to understand. The story of Victorian servants was never really about food, the stale bread, the cold scraps, the weak tea, the dirty water. These were only symptoms of something much larger, a society built upon invisible labor, a society where comfort for one group often depended upon sacrifice from another. The grand houses of Victorian Britain were designed to display success. Visitors saw polished floors, beautiful gardens, magnificent dining rooms. What they rarely saw were the people who woke before dawn to create that perfection. They rarely saw the exhausted maid climbing stairs with aching legs. They rarely saw the kitchen worker standing for hours beside a burning stove. They rarely saw the servant eating alone after everyone else had finished, because servants were expected to blend into the background, to be present but unnoticed, essential but invisible. And perhaps that is why so many of their stories disappeared. History tends to celebrate power. It remembers kings, queens, industrialists, generals, politicians. But ordinary workers often vanish from the record. Their struggles remain undocumented. Their sacrifices go unnoticed. Their names are forgotten. Yet those forgotten people built the world around them. Every polished silver tray, every spotless room, every elegant dinner party, every luxurious estate. None of it would have existed without servants. They were the hidden machinery of Victorian society, the workforce operating behind closed doors, the people who made luxury appear effortless. And for that reason alone, they deserve to be remembered. Imagine one final evening in a great Victorian house. The year is nearing its end. Outside, winter winds rattle against the windows. Inside, the family gathers around a beautifully prepared dinner. Candles flicker. Conversation flows. Laughter fills the room. Everything appears warm and comfortable. But downstairs, another scene unfolds. The servants are still working. Some are washing dishes. Some are preparing tomorrow's meals. Some are cleaning rooms. Others are finally sitting down to eat whatever remains. They are tired. Their feet hurt. Their backs ache. Tomorrow they will wake before sunrise and do it all again. Yet despite everything, they continue. Not because life is easy, not because conditions are fair, but because survival demands it, and that quiet determination may be the most remarkable part of their story. They survived in a world that rarely rewarded them. They worked in a world that rarely thanked them. They endured hardships that many people today would struggle to imagine. And still, they carried on. Perhaps that is why their story continues to resonate more than a century later, because beneath the details of Victorian history lies something universal: the desire to survive, to provide for family, to build a better future, to endure difficult circumstances without losing hope. Those desires remain unchanged. The servants of Victorian Britain understood them well. Every stale crust of bread, every cold winter morning, every exhausting shift, every sacrifice, every struggle. It was all part of a larger fight to keep moving forward, and they did. Against incredible odds, they did. So, when history remembers the Victorian era, it should remember more than the wealthy families who occupied the great houses. It should remember the workers below stairs, the forgotten men and women whose labor sustained an entire way of life, the people who rarely appeared in portraits, the people who rarely received recognition, the people who spent their lives serving others while asking for very little in return, because while their names may be lost, their story remains. A story of hardship, a story of resilience, a story of survival, and above all, a reminder that the strongest people in history are often the ones history almost forgets. Thank you for watching.